You're listening to Frankly Speaking Sports with Larry Frank on Northeast Streaming Sports.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special Frankly Speaking Sports interview presentation. Tonight, it is a great honor, thrill, and pleasure to have joining us live. This was a live broadcast Thursday night. For some reason, due to some copyright technicalities, or for some whatever reasons, we had some issues in some parts of the country, had 259 countries where this episode and this interview was not shown. So tonight it is our great honor, thrill, and pleasure to bring you the interview that we had live Thursday night with former Chicago Cub and New York Met pitcher and former general manager of the Chicago Cubs, Ed Lynch. For those of you that are Cub fans or baseball fans, wondering what may happen now that it's after the All-Star break, we had some great questions for Ed and just a terrific interview, and we appreciated him joining us on the show. Let's go ahead and listen to that interview as it was recorded live. Sir?
Sure can.
All right. Ed, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How you doing, Larry?
I'm doing great. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome in, as I said, former Major League pitcher, pitched for the New York Mets, pitched a year for the Chicago Cubs, and also was a general manager, a scout as well. So when it comes to baseball and baseball knowledge, there's probably nobody else we can better talk to than the gentleman right here. Ed, thanks once again so much for joining us. You know, Ed, I want to jump right into it. I'm going to start in from a GM's perspective. All-Star break's over. You're coming back. You have team, as you know, the deadline is, roughly 2 weeks away, the trade deadline. Certain teams have to, figure out or already know whether they're buyers or sellers. But, I want to ask you, what was this time like for you? And I know very busy. And the other question I had of you, if you were a team that was on the brink where you possibly can push your way into the playoffs or you may not, how did you make that final decision whether you were a buyer or seller?
Well, I'll say, first of all, it's a lot more difficult now than it was obviously before the wild card and now with the multiple wild card because, before the wild card, you probably had a better idea if you're a buyer or seller. And, the last thing you want to do is pass up an opportunity when you feel like you have a chance to win the World Series and you're a player away and you just don't pull the trigger on a trade that might put you over the top without mortgaging your entire future. And the second thing you want to do is be delusional. I mean, if you're, 6.5 games out of the second wild card, you have to be realistic about it. And, it's a zero-sum game. It's like, okay, we're 6.5 games out of the wild card, but there's 5 teams in front of us. So, not only do you have to win games, but the other teams have to lose games. So the biggest decision you got to make is whether you're a buyer or you're a seller. And let me tell you something, Larry, your owner's going to have some input on that too. So you're not making this decision unilaterally or in a laboratory environment. There's a lot of things going on. Your owner's going to have a say. You have to be realistic about what you're going to do. You obviously don't want to give up, a young pitcher for a guy that you're going to have for 2 months with the hope that you might get to the second wild card. So that's really basically the analysis of it. And I remember all the years I was always very envious of John Sherholtz. Obviously, he's a Hall of Fame general manager. He built an incredible organization, basically the team of the 90s in Major League Baseball, the Atlanta Braves. And all of us were very envious of him because every year he was a buyer. And let me tell you, it's a lot easier to be a buyer than it is to be a seller because when you're buying, you are acquiring other people's major league players who have a very long track record. You know what you're going to get. You have a pretty good idea of what they're going to be over the next 2 months, obviously. But even if you have another year with them, you know what they're going to be. They are what they are. And what you're doing to get that player is you're giving up your own player who you know better than anybody in baseball. Now, if you're a seller, now you're going to trade your major league player to the Atlanta Braves, and now you have to go into their system and try to figure out who you're going to get in return. And you don't know those players as well as the Atlanta Braves know them. And it's a very difficult process year after year. So it's much, much easier to be a buyer than a seller.
Now, as a player, Ed, as we switch over back to player, was there ever a time, I know you played 7 years with the Mets, a year with the Cubs, where the trade deadline was coming up and your name was involved in a lot of talks about possibly being traded, or, people obviously you knew on your team there was, and if there was, how do you handle that and still play for the current team you play for?
Well, it's called being a professional. I mean, I was traded from the Mets when they were soon to be world champions to a last place team. And for me to get upset about that, I mean, I was upset, obviously, but for me to come out and say something, I'm telling the world I'm naive. Like, geez, I never realized I could be traded. Anybody can be traded. Now, obviously, the Los Angeles Angels are not going to trade Mike Trout. But it's different now. I feel for players now because with all the internet, the bloggers, with all the, the sports sites on the internet, with all the television, back in the 80s when I was playing, you just didn't see your name. My name certainly wasn't getting circulated because I wasn't that good of a player. But even, before the Keith Hernandez trade in 1983, June 15th, 1983, when we traded Neil Allen and Rick Omby to the Cardinals for Keith Hernandez, there were no rumors. There was no headlines, Whitey Herzog thinking about moving Keith Hernandez. You just didn't see that kind of thing. And there was a lot of reasons why. Number one, as I said, the internet and all the information that's out there. And number two, it just seems back then when we had conversations with each other, they were privileged and they were private. And I see a lot of headlines. Like I saw a headline today, certain team thinking about promoting this player to the major leagues. I don't know, where does that come from? There's so much information and misinformation out there that players, I think, have become blind to it. They understand the game. They're not stupid. They know that they're a commodity. We're in a business, let's face it. We're lucky to be where we are as players in the major league. We're lucky to have the money, get paid the money we're making, certainly with so many people suffering now. So the players get it. A lot of it, there's so much misinformation. It just kind of goes over your head and, hey, listen, I just got to go out there and get people out. That's all I have to do. And that would be my advice to players. If you're a pitcher and your name's being bandied about, the old saying is, there's things you can control, there's things you can't control. And hopefully you have the wisdom to know which is which. And you can't control what people are saying. You can't control whether you're going to get traded. So control the things that you can control. That means going out, preparing yourself, go out there, have solid at-bats, go out, get people out, and everything will fall into place.
Now, I remember you obviously pitching for the New York Mets. Grew up a big Mets fan on Long Island in Suffolk County, Long Island, which you know that area pretty well because I know you coached out there. I want you to, when you first started with the Mets, you just mentioned they weren't very good, and you were there, and we'll get into the trade in a minute, but you were there. What is it like as a player to watch the progression of a team that is not so good to becoming very good?
Well, I'll tell you, it was an amazing experience. I don't think you can look at a team that went from so bad to so good so quickly as the New York Mets from, say, 1983 to 1984. And there's three ways that you're going to go about acquiring players. You're either going to sign them in the draft and develop them, or two ways, or you're going to trade for them, or number three is you're going to sign free agents. So the Mets did all three very, very well. They did a great job of trading. First of all, they did a great job. Joe McIlvaine and his whole crew did a great job of drafting and developing and bringing quality players to the major leagues. The good thing about being bad is you get to pick higher in the draft. So the Mets just killed it in the drafts of 1978, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83. They just really did well with Dwight Gooden and Darryl Strawberry and Lenny Dykstra. And then on the trade end, we got Ron Darling and Walt Terrell for Lee Mazzilli in 1983, I think it was. Then we got Keith Hernandez in the trade in 83. And then Gary Carter in 84 at the end of the 84 season. So the Mets really did it well on every facet of acquiring players. And I remember, Larry, coming to spring training every year, it seemed like there was another guy throwing 100 miles an hour next to me while we're throwing on the side, before in spring training. Whether it was Randy Myers or it was Jesse Orozco or it was Dwight Gooden or it was, Roger McDowell. I mean, you're talking about guys with just really quality stuff. And then position player-wise, Lenny Dykstra and, we traded for Howard Johnson. We drafted Darryl Strawberry, Kevin Mitchell, Mookie Wilson. I mean, the Mets just did a fabulous job in that era of acquiring players from all the facets of acquiring players.
Yeah, and those years, let me say from 83 to 85, you won 30 games for the New York Mets. I think it was 10 wins, 9 wins, 10 wins, if I remember correctly. So even though you say you weren't a very good player, very solid pitcher for the New York Mets. But you mentioned it earlier, and I wanted to hit on it because it was one of my questions. Here you are in 1986. I don't remember what the injury was. It might have been a knee injury. I'm not 100% sure, but you go down, and then when you come back, you're traded to the Chicago Cubs. Like you said, the Mets went on to win the World Series. I know you met some great contacts there with the Cubs, became a GM later, but at that time, and you mentioned it, not to be upset knowing what that team had the ability to do had to be real rough fight.
Oh, it was tough. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I never said anything publicly, but privately, I mean, I was engaged to my wife, who I'm still married to. We married 35 years in November, and I remember when I got traded, she really didn't know baseball that well, and she saw how upset I was, and I went from a great team to a last place team. But what I tell people is that, number one, again, I mean, it's a business. If I tell people I was shocked and couldn't believe it, then I'm telling people I'm naive. Because I remember I hurt my knee in spring training. I had one outing in April with the Mets against the Phillies in Philadelphia. And the next day I woke up and my knee was the size of a basketball. And our doctor, Dr. James Parks, back then said, "You've got a torn meniscus. We got to do surgery on this thing right now." And it's not like now where they do arthroscopic surgery and you're back on your feet in a week. It was a little different then. So I had knee surgery. I rehabbed it. I went down to the minor leagues. I was pitching for Tidewater. And I'm looking at the Mets roster. They're winning every night. I mean, they're blowing everybody out in the division. And I'm looking at their roster, and the last pitcher on that team, the 10th or 11th pitcher, was Rick Aguilera, who turned out to be a all-star caliber closer. And he was a rookie hanging on to that roster by the skin of his teeth, and we all knew he was going to be a heck of a pitcher. So I'm trying to be honest with myself, saying they're not going to bring me back and send Rick Aguilera down to the minor leagues because I'm making, number one, he's better than me, and number two, I had won an arbitration case that off season. I'm making pretty good money, so I knew something was going to happen. I'm not naive, but again, it doesn't make it any less painful.
Right. Now, when did you know, I mean, was it after baseball, Ed, that you wanted to work in the front office, become a GM, or is it just something that, you pretty much just was in the right place at the right time and was asked?
Well, I think I was certainly in the right place at the right time. But when I retired, Larry, I went home, and I was 32 years old. And I remember talking to my wife saying, "Okay, I'm 32 years old. I've never had, quote unquote, a real job. And, so what can I do to differentiate myself from all the other 32-year-olds out there who have experience?" So I decided to go to law school. I was prepared to practice law, be a civil litigator. I thought that would be something that I would enjoy. So I enrolled at University of Miami, Florida Law School. And I spent 2 years and 4 months as a full-time student. And during that time, Joe McIlvaine was kind enough to get me interviews in New York during my time off. And I remember my last year in law school, I went up to New York in August. In between, I went full-time and I went in summers too. So I had a couple weeks off between the end of the summer school session and the beginning of the fall. So I went to New York, and Joe got me interviews with both league presidents when they had league presidents and the commissioner. And so I went to New York, and I interviewed with Gene Budig and Bill White. And I remember walking into the commissioner's office, Bart Giamatti, and I had a wonderful conversation with Bart Giamatti. And he was a linguist, and his big thing was, hey, let's talk about the language of the game. And, he said something like, hey, where does a can of corn come from? And I said, the grocers and, back in the, in the farm days, they would hit they have a can of corn on the top shelf, they knock it off, easy catch. And I don't know if I can use bad language or not, but he said, hey, let me ask you something. What's worse, horse shit or brutal? And that was verbatim what he asked me. And I said, well, brutal is always worse than horse shit. And he laughed and he laughed. And so I was trying to expose myself to the people, the decision makers in baseball at that time, hoping that maybe I would get an opportunity to get involved in Major League Baseball. But you can't rely on something. You can't put all your eggs in that basket, because I was totally committed to be a civil litigator, and that's what I wanted to do. And if something happened in baseball, great, but I couldn't count on it. So I don't know if you remember this, but Joe McIlvaine became the general manager of the San Diego Padres in September of 1990, and I graduated December of 1990. And Joe called me up and said, Ed, I'm going to San Diego, and I'm wondering if you'd be interested in being our director of player development. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's like the greatest entry-level job you could ever hope to have. So I said, great, Joe, I'd love it. Yes, I accept. He goes, well, you got to be here January 1st. And I said, Joe, I'm scheduled to take the bar exam February 24th and 25th of 1991. And he said, geez, that's the most important time of the year for a minor league director, because you're trying to sign all your players and get spring training going, et cetera, et cetera. I'll have to think about it. And back then, before cell phones, I hung up the phone. I picked it back up. I said, forget it, Joe, I'll take the job. So I never took the bar exam. That's probably my biggest professional disappointment, but I wasn't going to let that opportunity go by. And so that's how I got into the front office in Major League Baseball. So I spent 3 years with Joe as a minor league director in San Diego, and then he got fired, and he went to New York as a GM. And I followed him to New York, and I was there 1 year with Joe in New York, and then Andy McPhail called, and I interviewed for the GM job in Chicago. And one thing, Larry, I could say I was disappointed I got traded to the Cubs, but one thing that Andy McPhail told me when he was interviewing me, he says, I want someone with a Cubs background. So if I hadn't gotten traded to the Cubs, I probably would never have been the GM of the Chicago Cubs. So it might take a while for things to work out, but always remember, good things happen, sometimes take a lot of time.
How hard was it for you to transition from that player to a GM? I mean, you see things, and if you still feel you got that urge or ability to do something, sometimes it's like, damn it, I can go out there myself and do that. I mean, how hard was the transition from realizing you're not on the field anymore to actually controlling what happens on the field now?
Well, I had that two and a half year buffer zone there where I took off the uniform, and then I went to law school, and I was totally immersed in that. And so I had 2.5 years to get over being a player. And by the time I retired at age 32, my arm, my knees, I was done, and I knew it, my brain. And so when I got out of law school, my playing days were so far behind me. So it really wasn't a bad transition. And I thought of it as a positive. I know what happens in that dugout. I know how players feel. I know how they think. And I think that helped me quite a bit in that that GM chair.
Now, when you look back at your GM time with the Chicago Cubs, and I'm sure there's always is one, but was there ever that one trade that you made where you look back on now and go, damn, I wish I didn't pull that trigger on that?
Oh, everybody's got one of those. And, some of the best trades you make are the ones you don't make, But, I made some good ones. Again, that's the thing. When you're trying to go over the top, and with the Chicago Cubs, it had been so long since they've been in the postseason that if we were going to get close, the people I work for, Andy McPhail and Tribune Company, Jim Dowdle, Andy McKenna, that crew, they were like, hey, let's go for it. Don't worry about the money. Let's go for it. So, I tried to go for it. And probably Matt Karchner for John Garland is the worst trade I ever made. But I also traded Brant Brown for John Lieber. And so when there's a bad one, there's a good one. So you can't be shy. You can't be afraid. And, I didn't see any of the players coming to our club. I saw John Lieber, obviously, but I didn't know John. He was an 8-ball for us. I'm relying on the person that worked for me, but ultimately it's my trade. I can't say, well, I got reports and they weren't accurate, but it was my trade and I own it. I wear it. That's fine. And it was 25 years ago, so the sting is probably worn off a little bit. But it's like anything else. It's like anything else. If you're aggressive, you're going to make mistakes.
Yep. How fulfilling was it to see the Cubs finally win it after all those years?
Yeah, that was something. I did have the opportunity to go to the World Series too. My wife and I flew up with my family. I was lucky enough to get some tickets, and that was something special. It was kind of surreal, really. And people get all over me about, geez, it was 108 years. And I said, well, I was only responsible for 6 of them, so I wasn't responsible for the other 102. But it was great for the fans. And I'll tell you, Anthony Rizzo's my favorite guy because I remember at the parade, he got up there and he was wearing a Cub jersey. And he said, he looked right at the camera, and he was like 4 million people there. And he said, this shout out goes out to every guy that ever wore this uniform. And he pointed to the Cub logo on his chest. This one's for you guys too. And I tell you what, I almost burst into tears because thousands of guys played for the Cubs and never won, and they finally won. And I was proud of the organization.
And I want to go into, before we wrap it up, some things about baseball going on today and basically your opinions on it. First of all, how do I say this the right way? I'm not a big fan of analytics. I never have been. I think we used them in our own way, even when you played, analytics was there. But I think it's gotten to the point, and I want to get your opinion. Do you think to a certain degree that analytics is ruining the game of baseball?
No, I don't think so. Analytics used to be a way of analyzing. Obviously, the word analytics used to be a way of analyzing a player's value. Now it's become a style of play. And, the commissioner is trying his best, and he's working against some really tough forces, because, he's trying to crack down on pitchers cheating, and he's trying to, outlaw shifts. And I understand what he's doing, and I admire him for it. But the biggest problem is the hitter's approach. We used to call them uppercutters. Now they call it launch angle. And if you're trying to hit a high fastball with an uppercut swing, it's very, very difficult. And if you're doing everything at a maximum effort, if you're swinging as hard as you can, and as a pitcher, if you're throwing the baseball as hard as you can because you want to strike people out, and as a hitter, you're swinging as hard as you can because you want to hit home runs, that's fine, but you've got to live with the residue of that. And the residue of that is record-setting walks and record-setting strikeouts. If strikeouts don't matter, there's going to be a lot of strikeouts. Yep. And, somebody said there's no such thing as a productive out. Well, I think there is. If there's a man on second and nobody out in the tie game in the bottom of the 8th inning, and you're the home team, and you hit a ground ball to second base, and that guy moves to third, that's a productive out. Absolutely. Or if he's on third base and you hit a sacrifice fly, that and he scores, that's a productive out. Nothing good can happen from a strikeout.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you. Now, I ask every pitcher, a former pitcher that I have on my show, this is why, Ed, and you've seen every side of it in the positions you've held. Why do you see so many more pitchers hurting their arms and having Tommy John surgery today? And I had the pleasure of having Tommy on my show as well, and which was an unbelievable conversation. But why do you see so many more pitchers hurting their arms today than, probably from the times baseball started until actually just after you maybe stopped is when this big thing of Tommy John's just been going crazy?
Well, like any major trend in any industry, it's probably 27 reasons rather than one. But some of the reasons, and I think the number one reason is when you go out there and throw a ball as hard as you possibly can, almost every pitch, you are going to hurt your arm. It's just a matter of time. And number two, the baseball is lively. Whether it's aerodynamically lively or it's the way the ball is manufactured is lively, or the tightness of the stitching is making the ball lively. The ball's a lot livelier now than it was. Players are calling it the Pro V1, which is the most popular golf ball on the PGA Tour. Every ballpark that's been built is smaller than the one it replaced. Every ballpark that's built has less foul territory than the one it replaced. And foul territory is very important to pitchers. We love foul territory because you get a lot of outs in foul territory on pop-ups. The technology is, the medical science is so advanced now. Because I hurt my arm in 1981, my elbow, and I pitched through it. Was that smart? No. Was it medically responsible? Probably not. I got cortisone shots, but I pitched my way through it. Doctors now, that science is so much better that they're not going to let me try to pitch through that now. They're going to do Tommy John surgery. And it's probably good, too. If it's my son, I don't want my son going out there with a torn UCL trying to pitch. I want a doctor to take care of him. But I think the big thing is, the ballparks are smaller, the ball's livelier, pitchers feel like they have to throw max effort or throw more breaking balls. They're pitching away from contact. We were always taught to pitch to contact. Make the hitter put the ball in play. The last thing you want to do is walk somebody. So, again, I've just named like 5 or 6 reasons. There's probably 10 or 12 more. But basically, in a nutshell, that's it, Larry.
Now, we've seen over the past 2 years a lot of large salaries, but they're longer contracts. And I always, as a kid grew up, you just mentioned it, you played 6-7 years with the Mets. Players would play a longer amount of time, more loyalty to a team, obviously back then. Do you think the contracts and keeping players longer is good for baseball?
Yeah, we heard the same talk when I was a player. We used to talk about, can you imagine Willie Mays or, can you imagine Mickey Mantle wearing a Houston Astros uniform? You just couldn't imagine something like that. That's the business of the game. And, the gulf between the highest and lowest paid players is a lot bigger than it used to be. And with teams going through so much pitching like they do, you're going to see a team go through 30 pitchers in a season. And if you look at the 1983 Mets, we were not a very good club, but I think we had 15 guys go on the mound for us for the entire year. And I think 3 of them were called up in September. It was just the way it was. We didn't have injuries. We didn't, if there was a game where it was 15-14 or we had a doubleheader, we didn't designate players between games. There wasn't that much player movement within the organization. So you had more of an identity. You could look at a roster and say that roster on April 10th is going to look a lot like the roster on July 10th. And now it doesn't, especially the pitching side of it, because of the injuries and because of the player movement within the organization. But I don't blame anybody. That's just a natural byproduct of the way the business of baseball is right now.
Now, Ed, last question before I let you on, and very important question, actually. As you know, this coming December is the deadline between the Major League Baseball and its players to hopefully get another bargain agreement done. How important do you feel that it is for this to get done in an adequate way, not just with the game of baseball, but also from a fan's perspective? Because, we all remember what happened during COVID-19. Wasn't a good look about the players and the owners, even though that's part of the game, even though bad timing. I mean, how important is it this time to get it done and to get it done before the season starts?
Well, I think it's vital. I don't think words can describe how crucial it is that there's no work stoppage. We've been through enough as a country, as a globe, and as an industry where a work stoppage would be very damaging to the game. And I know there's very smart people involved. I have all the respect in the world for the commissioner. I was a big union guy when I was a player. I was a union rep. I've been through work stoppages as a player. I was hired as a GM of the Cubs during the strike of 1994. It is absolutely vital. And the most important thing they need to do is to continue to communicate with each other. As long as they're talking, some good things can happen. And when they stop talking, obviously that's very disturbing, and it's not a good sign. It's not a good sign if they're not communicating with each other. And we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Tony Clark is a wonderful guy, very smart guy. He's got very smart people working for him. The commissioner's a very smart guy. He's got brilliant people working for him. They realize that it's vital to our industry and to our country that this game does not go through a work stoppage. And I'm sure they'll work it out. I certainly hope so.
Well, Ed, listen, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us on Frankly Speaking Sports tonight, taking time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you, Larry.
All right, my friend, be safe.
You too.
That was Ed Lynch, former Major League pitcher for the Mets and for the Cubs, and former GM of the Chicago Cubs. We'll be back right after this.
I mean, you can see right now, without LeBron, Lakers are struggling.
Let me tell you about a team I hate, all right? I know the Dallas Cowboy fan is here, so I had to make sure he knew how much I hate this.
Already.
I've often said that the people who run baseball, they try very hard to ruin it.
I'm from Brooklyn. I don't have a problem saying it to his face. Oh, from Brooklyn. Hey, isn't he?
You're listening to Frankly Speaking Sports with Larry Frank on Northeast Streaming Sports.
And I want to thank everybody so very, very much for tuning into that live interview we did on Thursday night with former GM of the Chicago Cubs, Ed Lynch, and he also is a former player for the New York Mets and the Chicago Cubs. Once again, we'll be back with our regularly scheduled programming this Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, this was a Frankly Speaking Sports interview special. Good night.